I really want this to be a discussion. And I also want to point out that although we're going to be discussing the underlying causes, which I think Craig Patterson is like, what about the underlying causes? Well, I think that's what we need to talk about. But I also think we need to talk about what we do about that. Like identifying problems is one thing, but finding solutions to those problems is probably the more important thing, right? Because that's what we're up against. So Sunil and Yanir, I've got your hands up in the back of my mind. Um, the first thing that I'm just going to mention that people have suggested when we talk about this is that we as humans are flawed, and we are unable to deal with such a broad, complex threat as climate change. This isn't like because I've always had this like we dealt with the Second World War. We knew there were Nazis invading various countries. We responded to that appropriately, and we had victory there. And that's kind of the dream, I think, of people who care about climate is for us to approach the crisis similarly to World War II. Um, but there are some fundamental difference between World War II and the current crisis we find ourselves in. The first is that it's much more intangible, right? This is not a threat at our door. This is an impending, slow-moving threat, and and our deaths aren't expected tomorrow. It may not even be our deaths, it may be our children's deaths, and therefore we are less um, or maybe poorly designed to approach that kind of thing. Because I do think we need to acknowledge that one of the successes of being the human species is forethought. And the ability to anticipate problems and manage them. That's how we've gotten to being the parasite on the world that we are today. Um, so that's the first kind of suggestion is that we're fundamentally flawed. Now, the problem with that framing in my mind is that it's not fixable. We can't change being human. So therefore, if it is, I think somebody put in the chat, maybe we're in a collective suicide. I don't actually think so. I don't, because suicide implies intentionality. We want to die. I don't think anybody wants to die. I think we're more kind of slow walking our way here. Um, but it, but I do think by framing it as a innate human flaw, it's not fixable, and therefore we might as well just throw up our hands and say we're screwed. Um, Now, the other thing I wanted to posit, which I think is really important in my mind because we've talked about it multiple times over the last 3 days, um, and Stephen actually kind of referred to it, and it's this combination of neoliberalism and corporatism. Um, so it's been brought up in relation to a lot of the issues that we've talked about in the last 3 days, including COVID, and so I think it's worthwhile unpacking that a little bit. Now, there's three sources that I'm using for this discussion. The first is Naomi Klein, and I'm a huge hero of Naomi Klein. She's written two books that are really important, I think that I mean she's written many important books, but the ones that I want to refer to is one called The Shock Doctrine and another one called This Changes Everything. And they're basically both about neoliberalism. The Shock Doctrine is specifically about the tendency of neoliberalist economists to move into countries that are suffering from problems and then kind of take over that economy and force in reforms that are neoliberalist in nature to transform those economies into neoliberalism. And I'll use a couple of examples. So if you haven't read either of those books, I recommend them. They're excellent. The other one is a 2021 book by Kate Aronoff called Overheated: How Capitalism Broke the Planet and How We Fight Back. And the final one is a paper which I'll put in the chat when I'm done my talk. It's called Neoliberalism and Climate Change: How Free Market Myth Has Prevented Climate Action. I think the first thing we need to do before we actually unpack this is define neoliberalism, because I think it's thrown around a lot. neoliberalism is destroying us. But what is neoliberalism? And this is a school of economic thought which has been exemplified by the Chicago School of Economics, University of Chicago, and it's been really successful at infiltrating a lot of our systems. There are three tenets of neoliberalism. The first is to decentralize democracy, the idea that um, uh, large institutions are, by their very nature, inefficient and bureaucratic, and therefore, the more decentralized, the more local your governing systems are, the better it is. So, cities better than states, better than countries, much better than international institutions, and you can see that very well in the United States' approach to over the last not only year but over the last 30 years amongst many different leaders. The second is to defund public investment. So basically, that's the idea that um, governments are, by their very nature, inefficient, and therefore private institutions will always be better at providing services than public institutions. And the final thing is deregulating the economy. The idea there is that all regulations, all regulators are easily corrupted by moneyed interests, so that if the moneyed interests have influence over regulations, they will benefit the larger corporations rather than the public, and therefore regulations are bad. If you want to summarize it, it's that markets win. Free markets are the dream, and the free markets will always triumph over centralized authority. So, um, so let's unpack some of those tenets and why this is maybe an issue for democracy. I mean, for the climate. The first thing is that a lot of the um, problems that we have are common good problems, and that if we emphasize the individual or the smaller group, so that's that decentralizing democracy, there's a natural tendency to act in your own best interest, and that because of the tragedy of the commons, which I'm not going to get into, that might impact other people negatively, um, because everybody's acting in their own self-interest. The general good, the general population sees negativity, uh, and and um, and that's pretty evident in the climate problem. The second concept, which I brought up, was defunding public investment. Well, there is a lot of things that private companies have really no interest in dealing with, but are really important for the public. Public goods such as education, transportation, healthcare, research and development, and hey, decarbonizing. So the this idea that private investment is always more efficient, I think fails to acknowledge those things. And the final thing is deregulation. Well, um, the problem is that the classical economic neoliberal response to this problem is a carbon pricing. Um, because what that does is it takes the externality of emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, it provides a price on that, and therefore it lets the market and economics drive the change. But nobody's doing carbon pricing. Like we just lost carbon pricing in Canada on a consumer level. It's pretty evident the US is never going to do carbon pricing. So if we are going to rely on the neoliberal approach, and that neoliberal approach is not um, uh, feasible, then that's a failure. So, people have posited that the this inability to deal with climate change at a from a neoliberal perspective is and from a free market perspective is literally the greatest market failure the world has ever seen, to the point of possible civilization extinction. It's so amazing to understand that the economists, when they've looked at their rational models, have said that on a balance of trying to be optimal for a functional economy and the time that it takes to transition, versus the impacts of the climate change, the economists have decided that 3.5 degrees is the optimum maximum that we can hit. Whereas the general scientists think that's insane, that actually would be have a high risk of civilization destabilization if we were to hit that. And I think that talks about the failure of economists to deal with this. Now, we as a society, I don't think where we're at can overthrow capitalism, not at the necessary time scale um, that that we need this change. But we could overthrow neoliberalism, because neoliberalist is a very specific, narrow segment of capitalism, and capitalism does have some tools, such as carbon pricing, such as regulating externalities that would allow us to continue in some way in our current paradigm of economy, and still succeed. Um, there are a couple of alternate proposals out there I just want to mention because people may want to bring this up. Recently, you'll hear a lot of people talk about degrowth. The concept of degrowth is that we actually need to start shrinking our economy. That is completely at odds with the capitalist idea, because capitalism is all about growing all the time. Markets, people put money into markets so they can make more money, and the only way you can make more money is by growth. But the degrowthers would argue that it's impossible to have exponential growth on a finite planet, that we are already overstepping what the carrying capacity of our Earth systems, and therefore the only way forward is to degrowth. I think that's worth talking about. I'm not sure if that's the solution. On the far other side, is people may over the last year have heard this term about abundance paradigm, and it's completely the opposite. It's like the idea there is that human beings cannot accept a world where our lifestyle is negatively impacted, even to allow our children to have a better planet. We, as humans, always need more and more and more, um, and and that because solar power and battery power has become so cheap that we can actually provide humanity with as much abundance as it needs, um, and deal with the climate crisis while actually making us richer as a society. And one of the examples that people will show is that just recently in Australia, solar power has become so prevalent and so cheap that you can actually get 3 hours of free power every day over the entire country of Australia in the middle of the day because of how much solar power is going onto the grid. You can charge all your batteries, you can heat up all your water, you can air condition all your houses as much as you want because there are no restrictions, because energy from solar and battery has become so cheap. Now, that actually is going to lead right into, I think, Lisa's point, because I think Lisa is going to be pointing out that and I don't want to put words in your mouth, Lisa, but I do feel that we probably do have a differentiation of opinion here. That Lisa's one of our fundamental paradigms is that renewable energy can't solve this problem. We're going to need to look at nuclear. I think my concerns are many, but I would, from that paradigm, but I would just say that right now, solar power is almost free. Battery power is dropping immensely. We still haven't figured out long-term storage, which is seasonal storage. In my country of Canada, in Calgary, we don't have a lot of solar power in December, and we have to figure our ways through those windless days in December. But we do have really amazing brains as human beings, and when we apply to things, we can get great things done. And we are in a time where there has been exponential um, movements in energy systems, and we have uh, a a lot more potential for improving those systems. I'm gonna let Lisa first respond to what I've said, and then we'll start doing hands. But that kind of concludes my thoughts on the troubles that we're in.
Okay, I'm just going to show this really quickly. You see this graph? This is a graph of fossil fuel consumption per capita, 2024. Here's the United States, the most. Here's India at the least. Who's next up from India? It's France, then South Africa, then the United Kingdom, and so on. Why is France so low? Compare France to Germany. Germany has been doing Energiewende for a long time now. Look at that difference. It's huge. France is this low because it had a state-funded program of putting in a huge amount of nuclear. And they did it in 15 years when there was the Gulf oil crisis. And those nuclear power plants lasted many, many decades, and they're still good to go. They've taken some of them down as nuclear's become less and less popular. But the fact is, to solve the problem, this is what you need to do. Now, if you're thinking, oh, it's so dangerous, the fact is, in France, people live longer than almost anywhere else. So, there's no like background radiation that's killing them or anything. And in terms of, let me find this other graph I wanted to share with you. In terms of the general consensus of, where is it, of how dangerous nuclear is or isn't, I'd like to share this graph with you if you haven't seen it. This is from Our World in Data. What are the safest and cleanest sources of energy? This is per terawatt hour. So per terawatt hour, this is how many deaths you have per terawatt hour for coal, oil, natural gas. And by the way, this is all in. This includes the deaths in constructing the plants.
Lisa, you didn't put
So,
a slide. We're still looking at the per capita consumption.
oh,
So
you're kidding. Oh boy. Okay, let's try again.
so we can see
Stop
the
share. This one. Share. How's that? Is that better? Can you see the graph I'm talking about?
yes.
Safest, cleanest, safest. Here's nuclear between wind and solar, including the accidents in Fukushima, Chernobyl, anywhere else. All the accidents are rolled into that. That's how many deaths per kilowatt hour. And cleanest, this is how much tons of CO2 per kilowatt hour. This is data. This is fact. Now, that back to the point of brainwashing, I think we've been collectively brainwashed to be scared. I was scared of nuclear. I would go out and, anti-nuclear, whatever, until I educated myself and read Climate Gamble and looked at the data and learned it's nowhere near as dangerous as people think. I'll tell you what's dangerous. The path we're on is dangerous. The path we're on is going to kill us way before anything else. And in terms of the IPCC pathways to net zero, pathways to getting out of this problem, every single pathway in the 2015 report, every single pathway required a great increase in nuclear. Now, because nuclear is unpopular, they're starting to talk instead of that carbon capture, which is just totally a unicorn stuff that's, in your dreams. We can't rely on stuff in our dreams. We need to rely on technology that's been proven. Okay, I'll shush up there, and please let's take some questions from Yanir and Sunil
Yeah.
since you've been waiting so patiently.
Can I just make a quick response? I worry that if we focus in the next 45 minutes on whether nuclear and renewable energy is the right solution, that we probably won't come to a consensus,
That's fine.
and that none of us are about to go invest in a nuclear plant anyways.
Yes, that's true.
I'm personally more interested in figuring out this disconnect between the obvious urgency of what we're facing, the public and political discourse on that, and what we do to fix that. But that's, this is
Yeah,
a
I
cooperative.
agree. That's really important. There were two books we agreed to talk about, in this session. Shock Doctrine, which I read every word of. And by the way, in that book, there's quite an argument for this not being totally an accident, money being made out of disaster. There's a whole disaster industry that's been built since 9/11, and including, so I know you say no one wants to spend the money, but in fact, it's going into private. The way the governments are being restructured to outsource everything, private interests are making the money, and they're charging way more than they should be charging. So I think to your point there, the disconnect is for the economy, this is all really good. So let's go to Yanir and then Sunil.
Um, uh, uh, Answering Joe and Lisa about this disconnect in public discourse, I just wanted to say a story because I have this story in my experience. In 1980s, I was at a conference with Morrell Cohen, who is a scientist who was at Exxon Research Labs. And there is an article here that describes a bit of the work that they did in the 1980s to identify the risks, and they identified very severe risk of climate change. But the point that I wanted to make about this is that they knew at the time from the science that when you pump a system full of energy, you don't just get average warming, you get fluctuations, which are the extreme events that we are seeing now. The fact that we are connecting the climate change, which is mostly characterized by degrees of increase of average temperature, to the fact that there are these extreme events is part of the issue that has to do with this disconnect between public understanding and what is going on. And I just wanted to mention that because I don't know, I'm not saying I know how to make the connection, but this connection, which did not come out into the public from the 1980s work already, and of course, long time. Now, Exxon refused to allow their work to be published and, of course, gave different information, despite the fact that this was known at the time.
Yeah, I remember somebody saying when we were enveloped with smoke and camping as a group a few years ago, that she said, uh, I didn't think 1 degree of heating, which was what the heating was at the time, was going to mean this disruption to my life. Because 1 degree doesn't sound that bad. 1.5 degrees doesn't sound that bad. But when you factor in that means sometimes, 5, 6, 7 degrees of fluctuations, that's huge. Sunil, you have the floor.
Yes, Sunil, please let's have Sunil talk. Can't hear you yet, Sunil.
You're
Sunil,
muted.
you're on mute. You don't show up. Yeah, you are on mute. So if you could take off the mute. Bottom left by the audio icon.
He may not, I clicked on the ask to unmute button. Can someone make him call? There, it's now working.
Oh, good. Thank you.
Yes,
Sorry, Sunil.
I was actually unable to unmute, and sorry, I'm not in the best of health today. But I think part of what I was going to ask was answered by Lisa's 2 slides in the end. And I believe, because as far as climate is concerned, I think climate, fossil fuels, tobacco control, they all are basically driven by narrative, and the narrative is driven by a select few. And that's primarily because of the conflict of interest that we have. I give you an example. Solar panels is something that came up this country in India with a huge fashionable direction from many quarters in India, and villages across the country were lit up with solar panels, which were supposed to provide electricity to our streets. You would be surprised that within 3 months they all become dysfunctional. The actual cost of running those solar panels is much more than what we are already doing with the electricity that's available with us. If you want to have a solar panel system driving a village, you need enough amount of water to clean that solar panels, which in itself is an ecological drain which we don't take into account. It may be very easy to do it in Switzerland. It may be very easy to do it in maybe Australia, maybe New Zealand. But if you are going into a country wherein there are other reasons which will inflict injury to your solar panels, it's always a disadvantage. One thing. Second is when I was listening to you, I think we tend to forget on climate at least. We tend to forget the fact that there is no transparency as far as climate action is concerned. Nobody around the world is wanting to take the responsibility to whatever has happened to climate in last 100 years. And there is a huge amount of hypocrisy as far as climate is concerned. I wrote a few papers on climate with regard to that hypocrisy. I give an example. There's a concept of carbon credits which came up through the UN designated agency. So you can have carbon credits. So a country like Switzerland, which is rich, does have the money, buys the carbon credits from which country? Ghana, poor country, whose contribution to the world climate change may be zero compared to maybe Switzerland, whose contribution to climate change, whatever we have reached here, maybe 100. So actually, you are defeating the very purpose of equity, defeating the very purpose of going into a future which is sustainable as you claim it. And last point, sustainability, I find, is a mediocre concept now. And sustainability is being promoted to brainwash, as we already heard. Sustainability as a concept is being sent to brainwash people. We want to kill wisdom. Wisdom tells us we need to preserve climate. But because we are not into wisdom, we don't want to accept wisdom. We want to kill it. Again, I come to the last one. We have been having AI summits across the world. Last one was in my own country. We talk a huge lot about AI. AI is good. AI is. Does my country need AI at this point in time? How many across the world need AI at this point in time? But look around the other effects of the AI. What amount of energy they will consume? What will happen to the ecology with that AI that is recorded? What will happen to our water resources with that AI that is consumed? But just because of the fact that there are 100 people or 200 people who have the resources with them, who follow the elite of the world, they will push this agenda across the world. AI is the thing that is going to help my farmers. AI is the thing that is going to help my healthcare professionals. This is something that I don't hate in India, but AI will be pushed, and AI will be another drain on what we already are suffering in terms of climate change.
Excellent points, Sunil. Thank you. Robert, were you next? Robert's on mute. Can somebody? Can you unmute yourself?
Now I can. Couldn't a minute ago. Okay. What I want to do actually is introduce a sort of tamped down and I think more useful perspective of the humans aren't capable of dealing with this issue, but I think in a much more useful form. I want to make a quick comment. You know, my physics background, I can't resist mention of nuclear things, but I agree we shouldn't discuss it too much. I just want to mention my perspective that there's no quick fix in it, and I'll leave it at that. The perspective I want to make is from disaster research. And one can say that an emergency is a case where your response isn't up isn't as quick as the unfolding disaster. And we think about hurricanes. It's so all right. It's a disaster. It's really fast. As you've been describing the climate situation, I think the problem again is we have a response that isn't up to the speed of the disaster. And I want to suggest that there's another aspect to this, which is that, you know, humans do respond in extraordinary ways in acute disasters, earthquakes and hurricanes and so on. But to ask people to maintain a disaster mode over decades is really, that's not compatible with the way people live. And I think we need to take that into account. And I think what that means is our climate disaster is not really fixable, but I don't want that to be a depressing message. I think that there's that things can be substantially better or substantially worse. And it's the kind of framing, how do we point things so that we're not going to fix the climate disaster, but we can make it much less bad or we could make it much worse. And I think that's a useful framing. And I think that that also points the way to the kind of adaptation that has been characteristic of a lot of the sessions here. We should be trying to point things in a good direction or a potentially good direction. We don't know how any of this is going to work, rather than in a bad direction. And I will note that that commons very frequently get managed when one has cooperative behavior. I mean, I phrased that backwards, sorry. You can have cooperative behavior that manages commons, and there are many examples, and that the time scales really matter. Nuclear is going to be on a long time scale, and there's a lot that can be done before and whether or not it actually comes in. Okay, those are my points.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we should go to Craig, who's been waiting really patiently.
Yes, thank you. But I think Linda was next.
Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. Linda? Linda, oh yes. You go. Linda?
Hi, can you hear me
Thank
well?
you. Yeah, thank you, Craig.
Okay, thanks, Greg. I missed a couple of technologies in the story. I missed the hydrogen and hydrogen carriers. I missed large-scale battery systems that we're working on to store energy for those days and nights when we don't have solar and wind. There's a lot of work that's being done out there. I'm involved in that as well, almost on a daily basis in my work for the national government of the Netherlands. We do work on carbon capture and storage. I know there's a lot of downsides, but it's not impossible. It is being done. We're working on that. And I missed the maybe it was said because probably I missed a little bit because I'm doing things at the same time here. But I think I missed the material component. I wish that we could go to a scenario of abundance. I think we cannot, because we need a lot of material components to make that happen. And I think they're in short supply. And then one last point, no, two last points I want to make. This is more from my background when I was working in university. Well, one is it has to do with how we are trying to get profits to make sure that we will be okay when we're in old age, right? And at one point, this will stop because we will know that we will not even get to that old age. And then we will probably run into some kind of a turning point where those who have still invested in fossil fuels will have a lot of stranded assets. So I wanted to make that point. And then the last point is in international cooperation in looking for solutions in the field of sustainability. I've been involved in sustainability treaties with countries all over the planet, and dug deep into their approaches of how we strive for happiness. And this is maybe more of an idealistic point of view than a realistic point of view, but I still want to make it. Because of our consumerist society that drives a lot of the fossil fuel consumption. If we could learn a little bit more from maybe other cultures that maybe not necessarily have this materialistic point of growth and striving for happiness, maybe we could learn from that. One of the examples is Bhutan, where they strive for gross national happiness instead of gross national product. It's not an ideal situation in Bhutan. A lot can be said about that, but to stay with the theory on that. And I think what lies at the core of that is the concept of the philosophical concept of shunyata. And I would like to also include the philosophical debate into this whole discussion, and that would lead to maybe different ways of educating ourselves and our children. But it might be a little bit idealistic, but I still wanted to bring it up. Thank you so much.
Many wonderful points, Linda. We did actually touch on the batteries and the new battery technology, which is very promising. But thank you for all of those points, and we could use some good philosophy, I'm sure. Who's now Jeffrey?
No,
I think
Craig.
Who was
Craig.
it?
Craig
Was it
didn't.
Craig? Oh, I'm so sorry, Craig. Oh, that's Craig. Excuse me. Sorry, Craig.
Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity. Can you hear me?
Yes, beautifully.
Okay. I wanted to follow up on the philosophical aspects of this and talk about what I believe are some of the root problems that are undermining our collective unconsciousness regarding how we frame and how we look at these problems. I think there's three things that I've been thinking about for a while now. The first is double talk, or that words have no meaning. And it didn't begin in 1984 with the book. It began 2,000 years ago with Christianity and with how people can speak of love and act in judgment and violence and hate and genocide. And that has become unquestioned in our collective unconscious. And yet it manifests through manifest destiny and every natural resource that we've encountered. So, and it's become structurally connected to our society. And let me just give one example. Unemployment. Unemployment numbers only count you if you're just off unemployment insurance. And so places like the Pacific Northwest, where I live, where the jobs in the forest have gone away 30 years ago in droves and never come back, they still think the unemployment rate is 4%, 5%, when in reality, I believe it's consistent with what the Depression was, 25%, if everyone was counted. But we can't even be honest about unemployment rates to address an increasing problem that is now showing up as homelessness. So, to not get at the undercurrents of our problem, and there's two others. Who is the master? Is nature the master, or our illusions of domination and control? And I think if we think of that in terms of what Einstein said, you can't solve a problem with the same thinking that created it, we might begin to understand that nature is where we will find our solutions, not in domination and the illusion of control. Another way of looking at it is linear versus cyclical. Nature is cyclical. Our domination and illusion of control is linear. And as a consequence, even our discussion about energy is about supply. Why aren't we talking about how much is enough? Why aren't we talking about conservation? Why aren't we talking about that those who can use the minimum amount of energy or anything should be held up in the highest esteem as the true models of what it means to be a human on the planet? Until we get to some of those fundamental understandings, I believe we'll never achieve anything. Thank you.
Barking up the wrong tree. Thank you very much. Those were really good comments, or helpful comments. Really appreciate them. Jeffrey.
Well, thank you. First, I think this is a wonderful, wide-ranging discussion. It's understating it to call it interdisciplinary. The different perspectives on the problem are just fascinating and crucial. I just like to add a different perspective, starting with the observation that some people think that Germany won World War II because its elite and industrial corporate overlords were destroyed during the war, and it allowed a new generation of entrepreneurship to come up and create the Marshall Plan facilitated miracle. And what we're stuck with in the world, if not just the United States, is the establishment of the ultra-wealthy corporate elite class, which controls the narrative. And in that respect, I would go toward what Stephen was talking about and observe that we talk about inadequate mainstream media, but nobody ever uses the word propaganda. Back in the day, we talked about the foreign press, Pravda, Singapore Times, not being really newspapers, but propaganda. But when it comes to looking at our domestic information dispersal, nobody uses the word propaganda. Somehow, it's a little bit like pedophilia. It's a word you don't want to say. But in fact, when Stephen showed that little vignette of whether you were in fact brainwashed, I would say that the national dialogue has been greatly distorted. From my way of thinking, remembering very vividly the introduction of neoliberalism, economics, and the, I thought, rather comical. I'm probably the only one on the screen that read the George W. Bush economic report of the counselors to the President of the United States in the years that he was the president. They were comical and they were so propagandistic. That is not fact-based, but we've lately started to talk about misinformation, but this has been going on a long time. And it especially it impacts climate change and the value of clean coal and other things like that. But we've got to start using either proper wording or description or insightful attacks on this kind of public sentiment shaping that is destroying our ability to act in the civic space.
Jeff,
You are so right, and especially clean coal and natural gas. I mean, how can you resist? It's natural and it's clean.
One point is that we are at the half hour, which means we have 15 minutes that should be geared towards next steps. But indeed, you decide how to run it. You do have Kenrick still to rate.
Let's let Kenrick talk.
can I just reply
Yeah.
to Jeff briefly, and then we'll allow Kenrick to go. Jeff, I think you echo the words of a really important climate scientist called Catherine Hayhoe, who's Canadian, based out of the Texas, and she says we need to be talking about this. This is, as you kind of say, as you've mentioned, it's the verboten topic. Nobody wants to have a conversation about climate change because it's a pretty dark theme. Uh, and yet we're not going to be able to solve this problem unless we're able to have these kind of conversations. And you can see by the disparate views that have been brought out here that these are difficult conversations to have, right? Especially maybe amongst those that are quote unquote brainwashed to think that this isn't an actual problem at all, and think that this is a conspiracy by scientists to to challenge us. I'm just going to put a link to Catherine's book in the chat as well, in case people want to follow up on her thoughts, because she's really important. Kenrick, you have the floor.
Yes, I think this point about the need to shift the dialogue towards the impact of fluctuations rather than averages is really important. And that's something the complex systems community really has a direct impact on. Many of us have studied heavy-tailed or power law distributions. And in my own analysis, I've been able to show that the magnitude of the tail shape is exactly equal to the relative variance or the fluctuations for many models, and it's always proportional to that. And so if we could figure out a way to translate that into a more broader communication about measuring fluctuations and communicating the impact of fluctuations, that maybe would be helpful. I know, for instance, and I'll just keep this brief, but for instance, here in the Northeast, we're having blizzards, right? And people think this must be a evidence against global warming when of course the science has predicted these kinds of more extreme storms and more extreme fluctuations in the weather. So that I think would be an important thing to try to work on in terms of general education.
Yeah, it's very good. Excellent point. Excellent point. Adam.
Yeah, I'll try and say this quickly. I have long thought that in addition to beating our heads against the wall and trying to educate and have dialogue with people about the science of climate change, we should be doing much more on the economics of climate change, regulation, decarbonization. I think the economists have brainwashed us to think that because they only count the costs as the money that the losers will pay and not the money that the winners will gain, they've convinced us that we have to balance the damage against some cost number, and the cost number is grossly inflated. And we don't talk about the costs of remediation and adaptation and decarbonization. The social cost of carbon is on the harm side of the ledger, not on the benefit side of the ledger. So just a thought that whenever we talk about the need to deprogram people, we should deprogram them about what cost is also.
Yep, excellent point.
I have a friend who's an economist, and I was like, so how do you measure civilization collapse on your graphs? And he goes, well, it's just an infinitely asymptotic curve. That's like, oh, that's dark. But yeah, you can monetize civilization collapse that way. The other weird thing that comes with from economics is that they have this thing called future discounting, which they are very convinced is an important reality. And basically, it says that a dollar in 20 years, because of inflation, is worth less than a dollar today. Therefore, they can discount the economic impacts of future events and often do that to the point where acting on climate change does not seem like an economically rational choice to make because future impacts are just not that important from an economic perspective. It's honestly insane in my mind. Um, so, but
Yeah,
anyways,
Jerry, let
yeah,
me just respond that the economists in the Biden administration managed to at least lower that rate from roughly 4% to about 1%. And of course, now it doesn't matter at all because we're not counting the social cost of carbon at all. But again, I was making more the point of, what was the economic cost of replacing the typewriter with the personal computer? If you only count the money that the Smith and Corona and Olivetti lost, it's going to seem like a big number, but it clearly was a win for consumers and for producers.
Lisa, how would you like to approach the last 10 minutes here? I mean, obviously, there's a
I,
million directions we can go in. We could,
yeah,
on one side, solve climate change entirely, which I'm
we're
very
not going to
supportive of
solve
that.
climate change. I
Um,
think what we need to come out of with this is see if do the team exercise, let people propose projects that they would like to work on, and then they can join. Now, I hope, Sharon, that you can manage this somehow, because I know there's been so many of these, but the way we've done it in the past is people have put down proposals about what they want to work on. And they make teams, and then they can work on it, and then we can have results coming out of this conference. Does that make sense to you, Joe? That's what we've done.
yeah.
That's what we did last year. It worked,
Yep.
right?
We've already started that process with gathering what projects people want to work on and who wants to work on what. I don't know if Yanir wants to take this time to show
Yeah, I'd love to hear Yanir's
that, maybe.
thoughts as the leader of this.
Let me, I just want to point to a couple of things. And yes, I think the first thing to do is if people want to work on projects, whether on this topic in general or whether in some specific aspect of it, the best thing right now to do is to put your name in the chat, indicate what you would like to participate in. And I will also share the current status of the team efforts so you can see how this is really expanded. But why don't you go ahead and put your name and topic, again, generally this workshop topic or anything more specific. You can also put in other things. There's really no limitation. But if you put it into the chat, we'll collect them and make it available further. Now, if you guys want to say anything about some of the topics that you heard that people might indicate for their interest, go ahead. I just wanted to give people the opportunity to start putting that information into the chat.
Yeah. So,
Yeah, I'll
for
just
example, Craig has put that something down. So you just add your thumbs up or your heart or whatever, and so on. Sorry, go ahead, Joe.
Yeah, I mean, this is such a big topic. I like honestly, from my little section, what's my proposal? We overthrow capitalism, or neoliberalism. It's kind of almost ludicrous to mention that, but there's a really funny statement which many of you may have heard before. It's easier for someone to imagine the collapse of civilization before they imagine the collapse of capitalism. Um, and it's very true, right? When you think about it. Um, so I honestly have no projects to propose because I'm not sure how to deal with this other than maybe having conversations going further. I don't think an hour and 15 minutes is enough to deal with the problem of neoliberalism. When I think of attempted solutions to this, I think about the the one percenter, what was it called? Occupy Wall Street movement, which was,
Mm,
15 years ago. Um,
mm.
and, there have been various attempts. I mean, honestly, I think one of the more successful efforts on this was Greta Thunberg, efforts and her leadership on this. And we can unpack why that was successful. I don't know. But I'd love to continue this conversation. If anybody even wants to do that as kind of this is a first step towards having deeper conversations on neoliberalism and how to manage it.
So sure, I'm going to add that into the chat here, and then people can join and continue the conversation as a topic.